Hello and welcome back to the Poetry Corner. This is our final poem for Remembrance Sunday. It's the cheerful one as well. Another poem by Studdert-Kennedy, the Anglican chaplain with the troops in the First World War. Another poem drawn from his own wrestling with his faith in the face of the horrors he saw and experienced. Some of you will have heard this one before. It's his poem Easter. It's an old favourite of mine, but I think it's worth repeating. So, without further ado, Easter by Studdert-Kennedy. There was rapture of spring in the morning when we told our love in the wood. For you were the spring in my heart, dear lad, and I vowed that my life was good. But there's winter of war in the evening, and lowering clouds overhead. There's wailing of wind in the chimney nook, and I vow that my life lies dead. For the sun may shine on the meadowlands, and the dog rose bloom in the lanes. But I've only weeds in my garden, lad, wild weeds that are rank with the rains. One solace there is for me, faint but sweet, as it floats on the wind of the years, a whisper that spring is the last true thing, and that triumph is born of tears. It comes from a garden of other days, and an echoing voice that cries, "Behold, I am alive for evermore, and in me the dead shall rise." A poem of Kennedy's, written very much from his experience of taking the news of the loss of a loved one to family back home. And it's written in the voice of a loved one who is heard of the loss of probably her husband or boyfriend. And at first her response is complete desolation. The whole world and the whole creation seems empty and spoiled. There's only weeds in my garden, lad, wild weeds that are rank with the rains. But then as she reflects upon it, she comes to remember something else. One solace there is for me, one comfort, faint but sweet, as it floats on the wind of the years, a whisper that spring is the last true thing, and that triumph is born of tears. There's a promise, a hope, that the most fundamental truth of the world is new life, new hope, new birth, spring, all that spring represents. And she says that that hope doesn't come actually from watching the flowers of the spring, but it comes from somewhere else. She's been talking about her life as her garden, but she says this hope comes from a garden of other days. And that's the garden of the tomb in Jerusalem. And an echoing voice that cries, "Behold, I am alive for evermore, and in me the dead shall rise." Her hope in the face of death, in the face of the loss of her loved one, comes from the resurrection of Jesus, comes from the memory of Martha meeting him in the garden of the resurrection, comes from his promise that in him the dead will rise. And if that promise seems impossible, then remember that he rose. The New Testament Gospels devote about a third of their length to all the people who saw him risen from the dead, because it's so important, because it proves that death is not the end. It proves that there is a hope beyond the grave. If Jesus rose, all can be raised from the dead. And so in the face of the very real winter of sorrow and suffering that the speaker is undergoing in this poem, she has hope for a spring. It might be winter for her at the moment. The world might be dark and miserable and wet and devoid of light, but there will be a spring. She knows that because of the promise of a garden long ago, when things seemed utterly hopeless, and yet the world was about to be turned upside down. It's a reminder that whatever the sorrows and losses we have had to grapple with in war or in peace, personal, public, professional. Whatever the darkness we might have had to deal with, whatever the winters we might find ourselves in, the story of Jesus points to the fact that resurrection, hope, spring is the last true thing, and the triumph is born of tears. As we think on Remembrance Sunday, as we wrestle with a new lockdown and with all that will be difficult this winter, let's remember that spring is the last true thing. Because once upon a time, not in a fairy tale, but in the real world, a man rose from the dead, and in him the dead will rise. Amen.